Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf lamed tet and menachot. We are in the middle of discussing the halachot associated with tzitzit. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. So we are on the top line of lamed tet amud aleph, um, and so uh, and we are sort of essentially starting a new topic, so we can just jump right in. So we had just learned one rule that Rava taught. And so although it says Rabba in our Gemara, the Masoras Hashas says it should be Rava. So V'amar Rava, because now it's continuing and it's saying another teaching by him. Shema Mina, that we learned from, again, what we saw yesterday is that you need to have at least that if one of the strings gets cut, then you need to have if there's a certain length to it, it's still going to be kosher. And so Rava points out that it must be that there is a knot at the end. So Amar Rava, Shma Mina Kesher Elyon Deoraisa. It must be that the Kesher Elyon, the uppermost knot. Now, what is the definition of the uppermost knot? Um, um, Rashi explains, by the way, Kesher Elyon, Hainu Namiyahu Kesher Lamata. That also doesn't mean that there isn't also a Kesher at the bottom. But now, bottom and top are very confusing terms because it all depends on how one looks at the tzitzis. But it seems like the top knot is the knot that is farthest from the garment, and the bottom knot is the knot that is closest to the garment. So again, it doesn't have to be that, but in any event, that's what it says. Kolomar, kesher echad b'tzitzis mia d'oraisa. However you hold, whether it's the closest knot or the furthest knot, you definitely need at least one knot. Ulahachi nakat elyon, and that's why we're referring to the furthest knot. Why? Because you need one knot, but let's refer to at least the furthest knot. Mishum de'i lo avid elachad pesher besofo. Because if you only have one knot at the very end, avilei shemikayim esa gedil kulo, then it has the advantage of at least also satisfying the need to keep the braid intact. That basically, again, what we're going to be doing with our tzitzit, and if you take a look at any of the fringes, you'll see that there is one string that wraps around the other seven. There are four strings, but they're folded in half because they go through the hole in the beged, and so as a result, there are eight ends. So the one of the strings is going to be longer than the rest, and you're going to use that to wrap around the others, especially in our garments where there's no techeles, where there's no blue thread. And so as a result, you need the knot not only to sort of keep everything together, but also in order to hold the wrap, not only to hold it onto the garment, but also to keep the wrappings in place. Because if you don't have that knot, it can just simply unwrap. But why does Rava say that it must be that there's at least one knot from the Torah? Oh, and let's take a look at one more Rashi. Do Raisa, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines down, last word on the line. Do Raisa, va'afilu yachol lichroch yacha. That even if you were to able to do circles, to do wrappings, very well. Ulehiskayim below kesher. Yomo Yomayim, and it would be able to stand and withstand, the usage for a day or two, even though you don't have a knot. Psula, it's puzzle, meaning it's not just enough to have the wrappings. You need the knot. Without the knot, it's not going to be kosher. Because if you say, now back into the Gemara, that we're in the middle of the second line, because if you tell me that having a knot is only required rabbinically, so my itzrich lemishri sudden b'tzitzis. why do we specifically need to tell us that it's permitted to use linen in a with a for tzitzis? Pshita, it's obvious that it's permitted because when you don't knot any of the corners and all you do is put four threads through them, even if the garment is linen and the tzitzis are wool, which ordinarily you would say is constitutes shatnez and therefore is prohibited. If you don't actually have any knots connecting the two together, and all you do is you go through the garment once, that is not a stitch, and therefore it would not constitute a biblical problem of shatnez because they're not actually sewn together. The only problem with shatnez is not having them touching each other. It's when they're sewn together in a single garment. But this isn't a single garment. This is strings that happen to go through the linen garment, wool strings that happen to go through the linen garment. That's not enough. And pshita, it's obvious that it's going to be permitted. Because if you just do one stitch, meaning if you all you do is pass a wool string through a linen garment, or vice versa, a linen string through a wool garment, eino chibur. That is not called attaching, and therefore it's not going to be problematic. Next Rashi, go back into Rashi. Maybe it even pays to keep a finger on Rashi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down, end of the line. De'imi derabanan lami li lemishrish sudden betzitzis diksiv lo tilbash shatnez. Right, we have the prohibition of not wearing shatnez. The samach lay, and the pasuk continues to tell us what that is, meaning that it's wool and linen. The samach lay, and then very right near it, it says gedilim taselecha, that you should make tzitzis, you should make fringes on your garment. So pshita de mutter, it's clear that the juxtaposition is telling us that we're allowed to do it. But we know that it's mutter because even if you do one stitch, it's not considered connected. Okay, because that so ela shmamina do raisa. So that shows that in fact it must be biblical to have at least one knot. Okay, so that in fact is where we come out, that it's biblical, that a requirement that if you don't have any knots in the corner of your tzitzis, it's clear that that is going to be an invalid corner of your tzitzit. All right, so Amar Rabba bar Rav Ada, Amar Rav Ada, Amar Rav. So Rabba said in the name of his father, Rav Ada, who said in the name of Rav, Im nifsa kachutmi karo psula. Well, this code returns us back to the topic of torn strings. And he says that if you have a thread that is torn at the base, then it is going to be invalid. So again, I'll take out my tzitzis to make sure that it's clear. This is what we talked about before, talked about yesterday, right? So we have, again, here's the tzitzis. Here is the base, right? So if, in fact, any of the strings tear down here next to the garment, so then it's going to be pasul. The garment is not going to be valid tzitzis. So that is what Rabba bar Rav Ada says in the name of Rav Ada, in the name of Rab. So now we're going to challenge that. Maybe we could say that it's going to be okay. Yosef Rav Nachman v'ka'amar laha shmaita. Esvei Rava Rav Nachman. So Rava asked Rav Nachman, who was telling over this lesson, so he asked the following: B'med dvarim amurim. We have a rule with respect to the length of the tzitzis. This is a brisa. And when do we say that there's a minimum length to the tzitzis? B'tchila. So that's all that. Well, let's take a look at Rashi. B'med dvarim amurim. This is Rashi 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. B'med dvarim amurim. D'be'inon shiur l'tzitzis k'damrinan l'kaman. When do we say that there is a minimum length to our fringes? As we're going to see shortly on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Bet, Kama Tehei Mishuleshes, how long does it have to be? So that is betchila so that is when that is at the very beginning, in the initial moments. Take a look at the next Rashi. B'tchila so b'shas asiyah, at the time that the tzitzis are made. Aval b'sofo kagon im nifsak la'achar zman. But if in fact something breaks later, right? What do we say in the brisa? Back into the brisa. So take a look. We're now 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the last word on the line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down in the Gemara. Shirav, the Gardumav, Kol Shehu. As long as there is any remnants or any stub or any stump, then it's going to be sufficient. So my Shirav, my Gardumav. Why does this brisa reference both Shirav and Gardumav? My lav Shirav de Ifsik Minahu v'ishtar minahu. What isn't the case of shirav, of remnants, an indication that there's something left, and therefore gardumam the igardum igardumi. That when it says that there's a stump, it means that it's completely cut off and that there isn't anything left. Meaning that it's just the case that Rav said about that if you tore a thread at its base, it's going to be invalid. And yet this brisa is now telling us that in fact it's not invalid, that in fact it is kosher even if you have a tear at the very bottom. No, that is not the correct reading. Chada katani. Really, it's all teaching one rule. The reference to shirav and gardumav is not two things, it's one thing. Shiyure gardumav kolshehu. No, the remnants of the leftover threads have to have some measure, have to have a certain amount of length to them. Velema gardumav, shirav lamali. Well, 1 second. Once you're telling me that there's basically, you can be as small as you want and everything is fine, just use the word gardumav, that it's a stump. Don't tell me also remnants. Why do I need both? HaKamashmalan. Here's what it's telling us. It's telling us the law that we saw yesterday. Debi'inan shiyura legardumav kedei la'anvan. That how do I figure out how much of a remnant needs to be left over in order for the tzitzis to remain kosher? It needs to be enough to be able to tie a slip knot. So again, our hava amina was that the cut was at the base of the tzitzis near the garment, and in the end, what we're understanding this brisa is that the cut is after all the knots, and that even, or let me put it this way, that's how we effectively paskin in order to be sure that our things are kosher. Now, certainly there are interpretations that effectively say that even if it were below the top knot, below the knot that is farthest from the garment, it could still be kosher because you still have enough thread there to tie a slip knot. But in the end, we effectively say that you need to have all the knots present, and it's only what extends from the knot that is farthest from the garment that it needs to have at least this length in order to tie a slip knot for everything to be kosher. And so the rules that I outlined yesterday remain the relevant rules. Okay, so now we're going to having referenced, this is maybe why the Gemara at the top line referenced Rabbah when it really should have been Rava. But now we're going to have two laws that are taught by Rabbah, and we're going to see that in each case, Rav Yosef is going to correct the transmission, that who actually said it. So Yosef Rabbah v'ka'amar mishmei de Rav. So Rabbah said the following in the name of Rav: Chut shel kerech ola min haminyan. That the thread that is going around the others, that encircles the other threads, that counts towards the number of threads. As Rashi says, Chut shel krach. Now we're going to count up from the bottom of the narrow lines in Rashi, and that's 6, 9, 12, 15, about 21 or 22 lines up from the bottom of Rashi's narrow lines. Chut shel krach, oto shekarach saviv, those that circle around, v'osa mimenu hagadil, and thereby create the braid, Ola Miminyan. They count towards the number. Shmona chutin of the 8 threads. The Shmona chutin be'inan kedemafarish that we're going to see. You need 8 ends. And that's because we're going to take 4 threads, we're going to put it through, and those 4 threads, effectively, because the middle of the thread is what's next to the garment, it ends up with 8 ends. And so the one of those 8 ends can be the one that goes around it. You don't need to sort of have an extra thread that you then put around it. Rather, it can be counted towards the 8. And that's, of course, what we in fact do. When we have those 4 threads that we put through the garment, one of them is much longer than the others, and that's the one that we use for wrapping. So on one end, you have all of them at the same end point, and you knot them all together, and then you put that through the hole, and the other end, you have 3 that are the same length and 1 that is much longer. And the 3 that are the same length, you'll knot together as well, again, at least temporarily, so that you have them, you keep them all together. And then you put them, ideally with a slip knot so that it's not a permanent knot, and then you wrap the longest one around the others, obviously tying knots as you go up. So first you tie a double knot, then you do wrapping, then you do 7 wrappings, then you tie a double knot, then you do 8 wrappings, then you this is according to the Ashkenazic practice, then you do a double knot, and then you do 11 wrappings, and then you do a double knot, and then you do 13 wrappings. And we're going to see that discussion very shortly as to how we got to those numbers based on a Beis Yosef that we'll see very shortly. So, okay, so back into the Gemara. So we said that the chut shel kerech, that the circling thread counts towards the number of threads in the tzitzis. So back into the Gemara. So now Amar le Rav Yosef. That's the Amar is the first word on the line, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 17 lines down or so. Amar le Rav Yosef Shmuel Amra v'lo Rav. That in fact it was Shmuel who said this, not Rav. And it Marnami. In fact, we have a statement that corroborates Rav Yosef's position. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Sachli Rabbi Yoshia Dimun Usha. Rav Oshia from Usha told me, and now you have to clearly add the language of the Gimel in Mesoras Hashas, Mishmei de Shmuel, and he told it to me in the name of Shmuel. Chut shel krach olel la min minyan. It counts towards the number. So that's the that is situation number 1, and again, that's that the string that goes around the others counts towards the 8 strings that you need for your tzitzis. Yosef, and now this should be Rabbah, because again, it's clear. It seems like clear that the Gemara just, which often makes them get confused between Rabbah and Rava. Here, we just had one story of Yosef Rabbah, so it makes sense that the next story is also Yosef Rabbah. Just like we had one statement of Rava, and then we said Va'amar Rabbah, and we needed to change it to Rava. So too here, that we had one statement where Yosef Rabbah, and now we changed the Rava to Rabbah as well to match that as well. So Rabbah was sitting, the Ka'amar Mishmei de Shmuel, and now he's going to tell something in the name of Shmuel, and unfortunately he's going to get that wrong also, according to Rav Yosef. Tcheles shekarach rubuk sheira. You know what? If most of the now, tcheles here, it's important to understand that unfortunately, sometimes words in the Gemara can have multiple meanings. And here, tcheles does not mean just the blue thread, but rather take a look at Rashi. Tcheles, this is 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, about 16, 17 lines up in the 18 lines up in the Rashi. Tcheles, zeu shem kol hatzitzis. That's the name that we're going to use for all of the fringe. So so even though the fringe is not just tcheles, but it's also white strings as well, we're referring, when we say that the tcheles, that the majority of the tcheles is
karach is braided, is encircled. So then that's what we're going to say, and that's going to be kosher. So the bottom line is that if we take a look, so again, I'll use my tzitzis as an example, right? So the idea that we're going to see that the ideal length of the tzitzis is that 2/3 should be string and 1/3 should be the knots. And now we're saying what happens if the knots, instead of just taking up the 1/3, and here you can see that my knots are roughly 1/3 because I can fold back the tzitzis on themselves and get to the starting point. So the knots are supposed to be 1/3 and the strings are supposed to be 2/3. But here we're saying that if the encircled portion of the string was a majority, so for example, let's say you had them going all the way out to here, and you just kept doing more knots and more wrapping, and so all you had of the strings was just a little bit of string. That is kosher. That is kosher, is what Rabbah is saying in the name of Shmuel. And let's take a look at Rashi. Shekarach Ruba. Sha'asa Shnei Shlishi Gedil. Let's say you did 2/3 braids, the Shlish Anaf, and 1/3 branch. Branches are basically, Anaf are branches, but what they mean is the loose aspects of the strings. That's what the Anaf are. Kshera, it's going to be kosher. The Afal Gaf, the mitzvah shlish gedil, that even though we're going to see that the base command is that you should have 1/3 of braided, ushnei shlishi, and 2/3 anaf of branches, kedamrin on the common. As we are about to see, we're going to see that that's the way you're supposed to do it, but the bottom line is that that is going to be kosher. So Amrle Rav Yosef back into the Gemara. Rav Yosef now says back to him, again, same basic idea. Rav Amra v'lo Shmuel. You know who said it? It was not Shmuel, even though you just quoted Shmuel. It was Rav who said it, and not Shmuel. It Marnavi. And you know what? I'm going to show you that in fact that is the case. Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshis, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. Right. So we have a transmission from Rav to Rav Yirmiyah, to Rav Sheshis, to Rav Huna, and what was the transmission? Tchelis shekarach rubak shera. That if you have a fringe, again, tchelis here means fringe as opposed to just the tchelis shekarach ruba, where you have most of it encircled, shera, it is kosher. Rav Chia braid the Rav Nasan masni hacha. Rav Chia, the son of Rav Nasan, had a very similar statement of Rav, but it was an expanded statement. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Sheshis, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. What did it say? The first part's the same. Tchelis shekarach rubak sheira. If the tchelis is a greater portion of the tchelis is braided, it's going to be kosher. Meaning, if the braided part of the tzitzis was braided, it's going to be kosher. Was enwrapped. So va'afilu lo karach ba elachulya achat sheira. And you know what? You can even have just one segment of braids. Again, we have in our tzitzis, right? Again, this is a typical Ashkenaz tzitzis. So we have one segment, two segments, three segments, four segments. Here they're saying you could have just one segment and everything will be wonderful. Okay? So that's the second teaching in the name of Rab. And let's take a look at Rashi. Elachulya achas, and Rashi adds that single set of wrappings, hakafa gimel pamim, it must have at least 3 rounds. It has to go around at least 3 times. We'll see that in a moment. Okay, the noi and the beauty tcheles of a fringe shlish gadil ushnei shlishay anaf is 1/3 of braids, meaning 1/3 where it goes around, and 2/3 where it is loose. And so again, that's as I showed on my tzitzis, that's the ideal differentiation. You want to try and make it so that your loose fringes are 2/3 of the length, and your wrapped fringes, part of your fringes, is 1/3. The kama shir chulya. What is the measure of a link? Now, this is a little confusing. We're going to see, we're going to cite, well, you know what, here, this is, the question is, well, here, the first part is not so confusing. Tanya, we have a brisa, and this is the source for where Rashi told us a few moments ago that you need to wrap hakafa gimel pamim. Rebbe Omer, kadesha yichroch, the yishne, vishalesh. That when we say how big a link needs to be, it needs to be circled once, then a second time, then a third time. And so as a result, that gets you to 3 circles. That's where Rashi got his point. Tana, we have another brisa, hapoches, that one who makes the least, lo yivchot misheva, he should not do less than 7. Now, the question is what is this referring to? The simple read, and most commentaries understand this as being how many segments you should have. So again, we have in our tzitzit 4 segments in talitot. In general, 4 segments. But here we're saying that you should have at least 7. The hamosif lo yosif al shloshes, right? And you shouldn't have more than 13. Hapoches lo yivchos mesheva. You shouldn't have less than 7 keneged shiva rikim, corresponding to the 7 spheres, to the 7 heavens. Hamosif, yes, I shouldn't say spheres, 7 heavens. So hamosif lo yosif al shloshes, right? And you shouldn't have more than 13 keneged shiva rikim v'shishim avirim. You should because the 13 reflects 7 heavens and 6 spaces shebenehem that are between those 7 heavens. Now, let's take a look at Rashi. Again, Rashi makes clear that what are we talking about? We're talking about segments, because if we take a look at Rashi 3, 6, 9, 10 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi, lo yivchot misheva choyot. It's telling us that you shouldn't have less than 7 segments. And Tosos goes on, and Tosos here says, actually, Tosos makes the following point that that he notes that that our practice is to have 5 knots, and he cites Rashi, which doesn't say it as clearly in our text. But if we take a look at the Tosos, lo yifachot misheva keneged sheva rikiyim, and we go down to Perish Bekuntris, so it's one second to last narrow line in the Tosos on the left-hand side of the page. Perish Bekuntris, Gabi Tzitzis, when it comes to our Tzitzis, Shukula Keneged Kol Mitzvos. It's comparable to performing all of the other mitzvot. And how do we get that? Lefisha Tzitzis, if you take a look at the word Tzitzis, we have a tzaddik, which is 90, yud, which is 10, so that's 100, tzaddik, which is 90, yud, which is 10, so now we're up to 200, and then a tuf, which is 400, so now we're up to 600, ola tuf reish, that totals 600. The chet chutin, and we have 8 strings, 8 ends, the chamisha ksherim, and we have 5 knots. Well, what is 600 plus 8 plus 5? Ola taryag. That comes to 613. And so that is how one of the reasons why we do 5 knots, and therefore 4 segments, because each knot is before a segment and after a segment. And that's one explanation for how we end up with 4 segments. Now, what do we do? Why else do we have 4 segments? If we just said that you're supposed to have at least 7 segments, well, the other explanation, as we're going to see in just a moment, let's actually do the next little bit, the next brisa, and then we'll give another explanation for why we have these 4 segments. Tana, kishehu matchil bilavan. When you begin, and then we'll come back and do the other piece that I have on the screen. When you begin to do the winding, matchil bilavan, you should do the winding with the white thread. Why? Because hakanaf min kanaf. because we learned that when we said hakanaf in perek tesvav pasuk lamitet, that reference to hakanaf petil techeles v'nasnu al hatzitzis hakanaf, it means min kanaf. You're supposed to use the material that makes up the corner, makes up the garment. And what material is that? That is usually going to be the white. That's a lot less expensive. So it's going to be the linen. And so that's going to be the first thing that we're going to do wrapping. And then, of course, you have to do patil techelis. So then you're going to do wrapping with blue. Ukashahu misayim balavan. But you know what? When you do the last of the wrappings, you should do the last wrapping also in white, based on the concept Malin Bekodesh Velo Maridin, because we have the idea that we go up in holiness, we don't go down in holiness. And so let's take a look at Rashi. Kishahu Kishahu Matkil Likrok Matkil Belavan Shemeniach Shnei Chutin Aruchin, that you have that originally the plan was to have two long threads. You have one long thread that is white and one long thread that is blue. Lasot mehen hagadil, and you're going to use them to do to create the braids. Umatchil lekrok balaban, that you start to do the wrapping with the white thread. Ubeemsa korech al shel tcheles, and then in the middle you do a blue thread, v'chozer u'misayim belavan, and then you do a white thread. So this gives us the explanation for another reason why we have 4 segments, because we don't have tcheles. So if we had the tcheles, then we would have a white segment, then a blue segment, then a white segment, then a blue segment, then a white segment, then a blue segment, then a white segment, in order to get to our minimum value of 7. Well, if you take away the 3 blue segments that are 4 white segments and 3 blue segments, you end up with just 4 segments. So that's another explanation as to why we end up with 4 segments to our tzitzit. So again, we just explained all of this, the 7 and the 13, as explaining the number of segments. But the Beis Yosef notes that actually some understand this as referring to the number of circuits. It's number of times that we do around. And so as a result, it's not saying, yes, the minimum number of circuits is 3, but I'll tell you what the ideal number of circuits is. It's at least 7 and no more than 13. And so as a result, that's what it's trying to tell us. And so if we understand it this way, now we understand how we end up with our tzitzis the way they are. We have 4 segments because we want 5 knots, right? Because you have a knot, then a segment, then 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 a knot. That's 5 knots and 4 segments. So that's going to be how we're going to create our tzitzis. And we're going to start with, because we have the idea of Ma'alin B'Kodesh Ve'ein Moridin, we're going to start with 7 wrappings, and we're going to end with 13. And you know how we're going to do it? We're going to do 7, then 8, then 11, and then 13. That's the Ashkenazic practice. The Sephardic practice is 7, 9, 11, 13. And for Ashkenazim, the explanation is as follows. 7 plus 8 is equal to 15. That is Shem Hashem. That's Yud and then a Hey. So that's Yud K. That's Shem Hashem. Then you add 11 to, which is Yud K Vav K. And now we have total of name of Hashem. And then we have 13, which is Echad. So we end up with Hashem Echad. And so that is what we're trying to say with each of our corners of our tzitzit, is to say that Hashem is echad with each of them, while at the same time emphasizing the fact that our tzitzit are representative of the 613 mitzvot. And so that is the Mishnah Berurah describes the practice and provides the explanation. And again, the Beis Yosef says that based on his understanding,
that's how come he comes to the conclusion that he does, that we have four segments and we start with 7 and we end with 13. Now, again, the Beis Yosef had, because he is the posek for Sfar, he actually says 7, 9, 11, 13, and he explains that the same, basically everything is the same, except that we want Hashem Echad plus 1, so we get to a total of 40, because 40 is such a magical number in Judaism, and the Hashem Echad, the one that's extra, is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that is how, again, the Sfardim do it. They do 7, 9, 11, 13, and you also have the nice progression of odd numbers if you do it that way. So again, those are the two different counts. Those are the counts in general if you are not using Tcheles. If you use Tcheles, then essentially all bets are off. And how you're going to do it, you should definitely talk to your relevant Orthodox posek as to how that kind of wrapping should be done. But it would seem clear based on our Gemara that you would not necessarily do the same wrapping that we do currently of 7, 8, 11, and 13. Okay,
How
so
many strings of techelet would there be?
so that's a debate. We mentioned this yesterday. The Rambam seems to say that half of the long thread, which is used, the half of the long thread that is used for wrapping, that's going to be the tcheles, and you're only going to have one thread at the end
Right.
that is tcheles. Another opinion is that you have one full thread that is tcheles, and it's clear from Rashi and Tosfos that they think that you should have two threads that are fully tcheles. And again, Rashi seems to say that the white and the blue are equal. You have one long white, one long blue. And the reason that you have one long white and one long blue is because you're going to do wrapping both with the white and with the blue. And again, that seems to be exactly what we're saying, that you do the beginning with this last brisa that says that you begin with the white, then you do the blue, and you're going to end with the white as well. So you're always going to have an odd number. Well, don't have to. You could do 2 in a row with blue, but you would seem like you would have an odd number of segments, as opposed to what we have, which is an even number of segments. Again, but that's because we do not have tcheles in the tzitzis that are being described in the Shulchan Aruch.
In your first, you said there are different opinions. Did you say in the first opinion, half of the thread would be techelet?
Yes, well, that's
How do they make a thread that's for half and half?
well, remember, the tchelis is just a dye. So the
Right.
entire thread would be made out of wool, but only half of the thread would be dyed. And
I see.
that's my understanding of the Rambam's position.
So they would dye half the thread.
Correct.
Well, I gotta be okay.
Okay.
You have to be particular when you're doing the dye.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so now we're going to hear a story that relates to several of the rules that we've seen. So Rabba Barbarchana Havu Yasfe. So Rav and Rabba were sitting next to each other. Hava Khalif Va'azil Hahu Gabra. And a person walked by. Demikase Galima Dukulit Tchelta. And he was wearing a garment that was all tcheles.
That Korach?
Yes, like Korach. Yes, I certainly would. If this was Parshas Korach, I would call this a Daf Yomi coincidence. Uramile Techelta, and it had Techeles, meaning again Techeles here not meaning just the Techeles, but rather the entire corner strings. Ugadila Migdil, and it was totally Migdil. So what is Rashi tells us what that means? Sorry. Top Rashi on Lamed Tet Amabet, as we've now turned to Lamed Tet Amabet. And it says, Kol HaTzitzis Haisagadil. The entire tzitzis, the entire corner fringes were all braided. V'lo shire ba anaf klal. There was no branch whatsoever coming out. So Amarav Ya'e Glima V'lo Ya'e Tchelta. It's a very beautiful garment. It's a very nice garment, but it's not nice tcheles, meaning it's not nice the tzitzis. And Rashi explains, lo ya'e tchelta, it's not nice tzitzis. Now we're on the second line of Rashi on Lamed Ten Amud, mishum de'ein ba'anav, because there were no branches, there were no loose threads. So Rabba Bar Barchana Amar, Rabba on the other hand said, Yai glima v'yai tchelta. He thinks that both of them are nice. Okay, so b'mai kamivlagi, what are they arguing about? Meaning, it's clear that Rav is saying that it's not halakhically permitted in this manner, and Rabbah is saying that it is halakhically permitted. So why? What's the basis? As we've seen often throughout Maseches Menachot, here in the context of Menachot, when we say b'mai kamiflagi, it is not what is their argument that we know. It's what is the basis of the argument? What is the root? What are they arguing? What is the interpretation that they're using that is base of their argument? So Rabba Barachana Sabar, Rabba thinks Ksiv Gedil, Uksiv Patil. The Torah says it has Gedilim and it says Patil Techeles. So Patil is definitely a reference to threads, and Gedil is a reference to braids. So what is it telling us? Oh Gedil, oh Patil. We don't know whether we're supposed to use braids or threads. So you know what? You can do whatever you want. You can have braids or threads. The Rav Savar La'olam Patil Be'inan. No, Rav says, you know what? You still need threads even if you have Gedil. V'hahi Gedilim L'minyana Hu Da'asa. And the reference to Gedilim in the Torah is in order to tell us how many threads we need, meaning how many strings we need. Gedil Shnayim, right? Gedil, in order to braid anything, you need to have two of something. And Gedilim is plural in the Torah, right? It says, where's the word? Gedilim taselach, Gedilim taselach. That's Dvarim Perikaf Bet Pasuk Yud Bet.
Shoftim or Kitisa? Not
Uh,
Kitisa, Kitetse.
yeah, I think it's not definitely not Kitisa. That's next week's.
Kitetse.
I think it's Kitese, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's Perikaf Bet Pasuk Yud Bet. So it says Gedilim Taselach Loch. Excuse me, Gedisim Taselach. So Gedilim Arba. So you multiply the two by two, and you end up with four. So Asay Gedil Upotele Mitocho, that you should have a braid, and it should have petilim threads from inside it. So the idea is that the threads extend beyond the braiding. And so that is how Rav understands it. And of course, that is effectively how we paskin, that you need to have threads in addition to the braids.
Gedilim taselach arba kanfot kisutcha asher tichaseh ba.
Yeah, exactly.
That's it is in Kitetse, and it's just before the ki kach isha. So
right, the key for our purposes, and this is, we might as well mention it now, is that the immediately preceding pasuk says lo tilbash shatnez tzemer ufishtim yachdav. Don't wear shatnez, which is wool and linen together. So we're going to see that that's going to be very relevant as to, we already saw that it's relevant in the fact that that's how we know that you need at least one knot biblically, because otherwise, if you don't have any knots, well, then of course the thread's not considered actually attached. So we need to have at least one knot. And so now we're going to see shortly that there are other points that we're going to try and get from the juxtaposition of these two psukim, namely the fact that even if you have tzitzit, you can use the tzitzit even though they have shatnez, even though the garment is made out of linen and the strings are made out of wool. And that's because we're going to say that they have to be, on some level, the Torah's level of creating tzitzit is a linen garment with wool threads through it. So that with wool threads in the corners, because the even if the white threads in the corners are not made out of wool, the blue threads, the tcheles threads, do need to be made of wool, because tchelet is wool that is dyed blue. Okay, so in any event, so Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi. So Shmuel said in the name of Levi, Chute Tzemer Potrin Bishel Pishtan, that when you have wool threads, threads of wool, they can satisfy the needs Bishel Pishtan of a garment made out of Pishtan. Take a look at Rashi, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Lamed Tetem a bet. Chute Tzemer Potrin Bishel Pishtan, Otam Shnei Chutin Shel Laban. Those two white threads, im shel tzemer, even if they're made out of wool, hein potrin bisadin shel pishtan. You know what? They will satisfy the need for tzitzit in a garment that is made out of linen. Ima techeles, together with the other two strings that are made out of techeles. Va'af al gaf deleka hashta min kanaf, that even though based on this explanation, we do not have any of the strings that are made of the material that is the main material of the garment. Dahavi shel tzemer, because the strings are made out of tzemer, of wool, and the garment is made out um, of linen. Kaven tcheles shnayim chutin, because the techeles strings are two, and they are made out of the techeles amra, because techeles is wool. As we saw, this is a techeles amra is a reference back to Yevamos that we saw yesterday as well. The techeles amra ninhu, that they are made out of wool. Upoter b'shel pishtan, and they are going to satisfy the needs for a garment that is made out of linen. Dahad techeles kasav rachmana behedja, because after all, techeles, which is wool, is explicitly written in the Torah. Lavan ditzemer nami poter. So once we have wool threads that are techeles that are going to satisfy and be okay, it is okay for the white threads to also be wool. Bishel pishtan. Poter b'shel pishtan mishum laban, and these white woolen threads will satisfy the need for white threads even for a linen garment. So that is the statement that Shmuel makes in the name of Levi. So Ibailahu. So they asked a very important question. What if you do things in the opposite order? So you have a garment that is made out of wool, and now you're going to do, the question is, can you do blue threads that are made out of pishtan? Shall pishtan mahu sheyiftaru b'shel tzemer? Are we going to allow the linen threads to satisfy the requirements of a wool garment? Tzemer b'shel pishtim hu, maybe do we say that tzemer b'shel pishtim hu depater, that only wool satisfies the need for a linen garment? To kevan to techeles patra lava nami pater, that since you have to have the techeles that are wool anyway, so we'll allow you to have the white that is also wool and it'll work. About pishtim b'tzemer lo, but maybe you won't allow a wool thread to satisfy the needs of a linen garment. Oh, Dilma, or maybe we could say, Kevan tiksiv, lo tilbash shatnez temeru pishtim yachtav, because the Torah says, the pasuk, this is again, Parakabet, pasuk Yud Aleph, says that you can't wear shatnez, and then immediately says, Gedilim taselach, that you should make fringes for yourself, and if you take a look at the words, right next to Gedilim taselach is tzemer upishtim yachtav, is saying that you have wool and linen together. And so as a result, that is showing that wool and linen both work. And we learn from this juxtaposition, lo shna tzemer b'pishtim, v'lo shna pishtim b'tzemer. Doesn't make a difference whether you've got wool threads in a linen garment or linen threads in a wool garment. They're all going to be okay. So now we're going to try to answer this question.
But isn't that common? People wear this wool, heavy wool, certainly among, you see this very common among the Hasidim. They wear it outside.
Yeah.
They walk outside and it's a wool garment with black, black
Correct. And
coloring
nowadays, many people choose to wear a wool garment
garment.
in order to make sure that we're going to see this very, very shortly. There's going to be a debate, and we'll cover it. I will give you the outlines of the debate. We're going to cover that very shortly. That the question is what garment types are subject to the mitzvah biblically? That's going to be our question. And we're going to answer. Everybody agrees that wool and linen garments are subject, and there's a debate, and we have a debate lahalacha between the Mechaber and the Ramah as to how we paskin with respect to non-linen and wool garments. Are they also biblically required in tzitzis or not? So Tashma, but now we got to answer first this question of whether you could go in both directions with respect to wool and linen themselves. So the Amar Rachava, Amar Rav Yehuda, Chute Tzemer Potrin Bishel Pishtan. You know what? The wool threads will satisfy the linen garment. Bishel Pishtan Potrin Bishel Tzemer. Both directions. Chute Tzemer Upishtan Potrin B'chol Makom. And you know what? Wool and linen threads are always going to work. Va'afilu b'shirayin, even in a garment made out of silk. So, upliga ba de Rav Nachman. And this is an argument with Rav Nachman. To Amar Rav Nachman, hashirayin peturim min tzitzis. Because Rav Nachman says that no, silk garments are exempt from tzitzis. So Esvei Rava Rav Nachman. So Rava challenges Rav Nachman. 1 second though, we have a brisa that seems to be very clear that silk garments are obligated in tzitzis because it says hashirayin, which is regular kinds of silk, v'hakalach, floss silk, v'hasrikin, and corded silk, kulan chayavin b'tzitzis. They are all subject to the obligation of tzitzis. So Rav Nachman explains midirabanan. That is just rabbinically, meaning that biblically they are exempt. Well, ihachi emasefa. But 1 second, what about the following? V'chulam tsemro pishtin potrin bahen, and all of them you can use wool and linen to satisfy the requirements. And what are we thinking at this moment? We're thinking that we're going to use 2 linen threads and 2 wool threads because the wool threads are going to be the tchelis and the linen threads are going to be the white. So now, if you tell me that you can use wool and linen threads and we're talking about a biblical obligation, everything makes sense. That's why you can use kilayim in it because you're going to be tying knots between the wool and linen threads, and that's connecting them together. And that would only be permitted if you could have a biblical obligation. But Elai Amrat Rabbanan, if you tell me that the silk garment only requires tzitzis rabbinically, how could you tie both wool and linen threads to it and thereby create shatnez if you're only fulfilling a rabbinic obligation? How can you permit klayim in those garments? So Rav Nachman explains, you're misunderstanding that brisa. It's not wool and linen, it's wool or linen. Ema o tzemer, o pishtim. You could use one or the other, not the two of them together. And hachinami mistaber. And you know what? I think that that's the way, the better read of that brisa. Because the Katani Seifa, what do we say in the end of that brisa? Biminan potrin, that when it comes to these other kinds of silk, you can use that material for themselves. Shalo biminan ein potrin. But you cannot use silk for cotton, and you cannot use cotton for silk. You have to use the same material as the garment itself. So shaloba minan einam potrin. So amrat bishlam derabanan. Now, if you tell me that that statement is about a rabbinic obligation, hainu demifteri b'minan. That's why the tzitzis can be used with their own kind, because once the rabbis are saying that a cotton garment requires tzitzis, well, then the rabbis could say that how you fulfill that cotton tzitzis is with cotton strings. Then that's all fine. But but if you tell me that the obligation is biblical on a cotton or silk garment, it it should only be wool or linen that satisfies, and you should not be able to use other garments because our understanding, at least according to Rav Nachman, is that anytime you talk about any material in any kind of clothing material other than possibly leather in the Torah, it's talking about wool or linen. So as a result, you would need to have wool or linen tzitzis, fringes. So no, that is not a proof. In fact, I will tell you the exact opposite. Imishum ha lo area. That's not going to be a proof for you, Rav Nachman. Kida Rava, because we've got a statement of Rava. The Rava Rami, because Rava asked the following question. He noted the following contradiction. Ksiv hakanaf min kanaf. We have the Torah in Parshas and the Parshas Shlach where it says hakanaf perik tesvav pasuk lamed tes, where it says that you have to do in the corner, it meaning as the material of the corner, so you need to use the same material of your garment. But uksiv, but we also have when it says gedilim taseloch, it said right before semer upishtim, which is wool and linen. So doesn't that show that it has to be made out of wool and linen? So which is it? Are the tzitzis supposed to be made out of wool and linen, or are they supposed to be made out of the material of the garment? So Tzemer upishtin. So what's the answer? The answer is as follows, according to Rava. Tzemer upishtin poten bein b'minan bein shelo b'minan. When it comes to wool or linen, they can be used for any kind of garment. Shar meaning, but when it comes to other materials, b'minan potrin, they are only valid to be used in garments of their own type. And so as a result, shelo b'minan ein potrin. They are not going to be able to be used even in garments of a different type. And so as a result, it is the Torah itself that says that you can use silk strings on a silk garment, or more generally cotton strings on a cotton garment. So Rav Nachman kedetana debei Rabbi Shmuel, but Rav Nachman, who says no, that's not the truth, that's not the case, he goes like the following brisa. Detana debei Rabbi Yishmael, hoel v'nemru begadim b'Torah stam, since the Torah says garments without specification, uparat lach hakasu be'echad mehen semro pishtim, and in one context it tells you specifically in the context of tzarat, it says that there's going to be garments of wool or linen. So af kol semro pishtin. So that teaches that every garment needs to be wool or linen throughout the Torah. But you know what? There's another brisa that disagrees with that. Amar Abaye, v'hai tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, mavka mi'idav tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. You know what? There's another tana of the Rabbi Yishmael's yeshiva that disagrees with that. The tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, because we have the following, beged, that in that same pasuk where it says that when we talk about sarat, we're talking about semer upishtim. Again, that pasuk is of beged kiyebo naga, kiyebo nega, tzarat, beveged, semer, or beveged pishtim. So that's Vayikra Perak Yud Gimel, Pasuk Mem Zayin. So that Pasuk, it says beged. So Ainli Ella Beged Semer. So initially, when the first reference to beged, that tells us that it's got to be wool. Minayin larabos tzemer gmolim v'tzemer arnovim v'notza shall izim. How do I know that you should include camel wool or rabbit wool or goat hair? So v'hakalach v'hasrikin v'hashirayin, and the floss silk and the corded silk and the plain silk. Minayin. How do I know all of those? Talmud lomar o beged. The fact that it says beged semer O beveged pishtim. So the O comes to tell us that, you know what? It's even other variations of garments. And so as a result, that is the basis for Rava's opinion. And Rava's the one who says that actually every kind of garment is okay. So again, we have Rav Nachman and we have Rava. The Rambam and the Rif hold like Rav Nachman, and they say that only wool and linen garments are the only ones that are biblical. And because the Beis Yosef follows the majority of Rambam, Rif, and Rosh, he goes with he goes with this opinion, and he says, and he concludes like this outcome, and therefore the Mechaber, because that's the Beis Yosef, says in the Shulchan Aruch that in fact you need to use a wool and linen or linen garment. Tosfos, in fact, here if we take a look at the
So
first.
he would say that any other garment besides wool does not require tzitzit?
Biblically. It still requires tzitzis rabbinically, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation. You're not fulfilling the biblical obligation of tzitzit. All right, but take a look at.
So it's you're chayiv and tzitzit on another garment?
You would be chayiv rabbinically, but not biblically.
And would you use does he hold that you use the same material? Or does he
Yeah,
hold
well, I think everybody he understands that the rabbi said that you can either use wool, linen, or the material. He understands that it's the rabbis who say this, but it's that when you have another material other than wool and other than linen, you can use wool, linen, or that material's own substance to create the strings.
could use anything basically?
No, no, you can't
Not
use
anything.
anything. It depends on what the garment is. You can't use silk on a cotton garment.
Right,
You can't
okay.
use silk strings on a cotton garment, so you can't use anything.
So you can use silk on silk.
You can use silk on silk, exactly. Now, of course, that is the biblical position according to Rava. Rava says that silk on silk is fulfilling a biblical obligation. Okay, and now let's take a look, and we'll see who says that. Take a look at the first of the Y lines of Lamed Tet Amud Bet in Tosfos, middle of the line. It says Rabbeinu Tam, V'Rashi, Pasku Kirava. They hold like Rava, Mishum Dehu Basra, because he is the later authority. And so, as a result, not only does Tosfos say that Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam hold like this, but the Ramah there in the Shulchan Aruch specifically says that we hold that way as well. And that is the basis for our garments. For the vast majority of Ashkenazic Jews, we do not make sure that we are wearing always a wool garment because we're not limiting our psak to the Mechaber, but rather we're following the Ramah. And so as a
And
result,
what is that opinion then?
the opinion is that is a biblical obligation. That in fact, if you have a cotton garment and it has four corners, there is a biblical obligation, and you can use either cotton or wool or linen strings in order to make the tzitzis.
Wasn't that what the Beit Yosef said?
No, the Beit Yosef says that if you have a cotton garment, it's only obligated rabbinically, and therefore you're not fulfilling a biblical obligation if you were to use that as your tzitzis. And that is why Ashkenazim are more flexible on the materials used for their garments.
And the Beit Yosef would say that he has to use what for the
You have to use wool or linen, and that's why they use wool, because they're going to use wool strings, and I think that's the general practice is all our strings are wool, and so everybody's using wool strings. But the question is do you have is your garment made out of wool? That would be the requirement. The simple requirement, or the simple way to fulfill the biblical requirement according to the Beis Yosef and who's the Mechaber. And according to the Ramah, no, you can use a cotton garment because cotton is just as obligated in tzitzis as wool. And so as a result, that's why many of us wear cotton garments.
So according to the Beit Yosef, if one was wearing a cotton or a nylon or a rubber garment, he would not be obligated? Is that what he's saying?
Again, obligated rabbinically, not obligated. That would be incorrect, but obligated rabbinically. You wouldn't be fulfilling a biblical obligation. And since the reason that we're doing it, right, the reason that we are affirmatively making ourselves tzitzis, obviously, most of our garments don't have four corners. We are putting on tzitzis affirmatively. So as a result, we want to fulfill that when we're putting it on and making a bracha. we want to be able to say it that we're doing a biblical obligation. And so that's why, according to the Mechaber, you wouldn't use a cotton garment. You would only use a wool garment, or wool or linen, but in general they use wool. And so that you would use a wool garment because they want to be able to use wool strings.
So that's the tzitzit. But if
No, no, they're talking about the garment. They're talking about the garment.
I understand that, but so that's an additional garment. But if they're wearing a shirt out of not there aren't that many clothes made out of wool except wool sweaters and so forth. But
Uh-huh.
most clothing today is not made out of wool. This is
Correct.
maybe in that time they were. I
No,
don't know.
what's your point? I'm sorry. Go
Well, the
ahead.
point is that if we're talking about a guy, if one isn't adding the additional tzitzis that we make and we buy separately, and one's wearing stam regular clothing, it would be difficult to fulfill the opinion of the Beit Yosef.
Well, I mean, difficult to
Right.
fulfill any opinion because very few of our garments have four corners.
Well, that's a
That,
separate issue. I mean,
that's
I'm
that's
talking
the
about.
issue.
I understand, but I'm talking about the wool aspect.
Now I understand your point. Yes, you are absolutely right. The vast majority of our garments do not are not made out of wool, and therefore you would, it would be, and it's not clear to me, presumably you would follow the majority. So I guess if you had suits, right, suits are often made out of wool, and so a suit, that had four corners somehow, that would be another example.
Yeah, but it would be a little bit unusual for
Correct.
someone to
Whereas
wear
whereas the
hanging tzitzis
Correct.
from the jacket of a suit.
Whereas Mechaber would say that almost all of our garments could potentially, if they'd had four corners, would be obligated biblically. All right. Well, that brings us to another brisa regarding tzitzis, but that's at the top of Daf Mem Amud Aleph. So we'll continue from there, God willing, tomorrow. Sorry for going a little bit long. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.